Recorded.
Welcome, this is David Lee, and welcome to today's new app webinar, ABCs of Language Access Advocacy, Assess Your Practices, Build a Plan, Compliance Advocacy. This, the National Immigrant Women's Advocacy Project webinar is presented by the U.S. Department of Justice on Violence Against Women and the State Justice Institute in partnership with the National Immigrant Women's Advocacy Project, the Asian Pacific Institute on Gender-Based Violence, and the California Coalition Against Sexual Assault. Thank you for joining us today. As I say, this project is supported by grant number 2013-TA-AXK009, awarded by the Office of Violence Against Women, U.S. Department of Justice. The opinions, findings, conclusions, and recommendations expressed in this program are those of the authors and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Department of Justice, Office on Violence Against Women. I want to just welcome you all to joining us today. We want to talk briefly about how to use this technology. We expect a lot of people on today's session, and so it's great to be able to have so many people joining us. One of the features that we will be using is asking questions of you by having you raise your hands. The way you do that is you look at above my picture on the far left-hand side, there's a little hand there that says My Status. Please go ahead and raise your hand. It would be great to have everyone raising their hand. Let's see, I've already got, not all of you have, many of you are still doing this. This will be a way that we want to learn about your experiences and hear from all of you, so I want to encourage you to be able to do that. We've got half of you have raised your hand. Thank you much. I'm going to actually lower all the hands now. We do have a text chat. The text chat appears actually on the right-hand side of your screen. You can, where it says type here to send a message, you can send a message, and then you just press return, so go ahead and do that. If you want to send a private chat, there's a private tab, and you can send a chat to other participants in this webinar. Right now we're asking people just to say what city and state they're from and what the weather is, and I can see it's 39 degrees in Portland, Maine, but 77 degrees in Miami, Florida. We do have slides for today's PowerPoint presentation. They are available on the new app website, and I believe Rocio is probably going to put the link to get all of the materials for today's webinar into the text chat, so you can be able to get that. That will also be in the follow-up email where you will get a link to be able to reach all of them. So I believe Rocio probably will be writing that in very shortly. But people are still writing where they are in the country. We do have some polling questions that we'll be asking you later on during this session, and you'll get a chance to be able to vote in the left-hand corner. Please vote in the left-hand corner, not put it into the text chat. And finally, many of you are listening to us on the phone, are listening to us on the computer. That is great. You can also listen to us on the phone, and you can call in for some of the here, and I will put into the text chat where to be able to call for that number if you want to be able to do that. So with that, I now want to welcome all of you, and I also want to welcome my colleagues, several of my colleagues from Calcasa who are joining us. I'm with the California Coalition Against Sexual Assault. I also have my colleagues Versha, can you, in the spirit of the theme, we're going to be speaking within languages that we speak, so can you welcome us, Versha?
Sure, absolutely. Namaste.
Thank you.
And thank you.
Great, and I'm also joined by my colleague, Imelda Boone-Cobb. Imelda, can you please welcome us in your language?
Mabuhay, everybody.
Thank you. And we are joined by some of our presenters. And Leslie Orloff, before actually we get introducing you, we'll want to get a little bit of a sense of having people raise their hand of how many of you are in the room with you right now. So let's go ahead, raise your hand if you are in a room alone. Just go ahead and raise your hand so we can get a sense of how many people are in a room alone. Great. So I'm seeing, okay, it looks like, Leslie, we're getting to 100, close to 100. I have 95 said that more than half have said that they are in a room by themselves. Great. Now I'm going to ask you, how many of you have one other person sitting with you? So go ahead and click to let me know how many of you have one other person that's joining us. Oh, and great. So, Leslie, I'm seeing that right now it looks like 15 people have said that they've got 17 people. They're joined by 18 people have said that 19 people have said they're joined by another person.
Okay, and then, David, can you lower the hands? And how many people have more than 2 people, like 3 people in the room with you? Altogether, more than 2.
More than 2. Let's just see. So larger groups. And we've got 4 people who have said that. So great. Thank you so much. It's great to get a sense of how many people. These are, oh, no, now we're up to 5. So we've got more people that are responding. Well, thank you very much. That gives us a sense of how many people are joining us today. And I do want to introduce our presenters for today. And I'm really pleased that we have Leslie Orloff, who is the director of the National Immigrant Women's Advocacy Project at American University, Washington College of Law. Leslie.
Good afternoon. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. We're very excited to have you join us for this webinar. I think that's
great. And you actually have on your you have you saying hello in a different language on our Thank you. And we also are joined by Canon Han, who is the project coordinator of the Asian Pacific Islander Institute on Gender-Based Violence. He's the Interpretation Technical Assistance and Resource Center. Hello, Canon.
Annyeong. Hi, everyone.
Great, thank you. And we're also happy to be having Benish Anver, who also goes by BB, who is the project staff attorney at the National Immigrant Women's Advocacy Project at American University Washington College of Law. Hi, BB.
Hi, assalamu alaikum, everybody. We're really excited to have you join us on the webinar today.
Thank you. So now we do have another question that we want to get from the audience, and this one we have an ABC. So on the left-hand side, let's go ahead and share who's on this call. So what best describes you? Are you a victim advocate, which would be A? B, are you a victim's lawyer, which is B? C, you work for a government agency, and D is other. So go ahead and vote. I still see that more than half of you have not voted yet, but now we're getting to about more than half of you have voted. And let's go ahead. I'm going to share the results live. And we can see that 54% are victim advocates. Another 17% are victims' lawyers. We have about 8% work for government agencies, and another 21% are other. If you're other, let's go ahead and let us know what other role you play in the text chat, just so we can get a sense of what some of the other role is that people have. Love to see this number from you all of how many of you are doing this. We have a doctoral student, a state coalition staff person, civil legal services. We've got more state coalition, MPP students, outreach counselor, legal aid, more legal crime victims, legal network, Catholic Charities, immigration, other attorneys, admin assistant, transitional housing, legal services, outreach specialist, shelter advocate, civil liberties, civil legal services advocate, bilingual legal services advocate. So great. Well, thank you for giving us a sense of who is in the room. We have a lot of advocates, and 57% it's settled on. So I'm going to go ahead and withdraw that question, and I'm going to go ahead and move this to BB. Can you share today's learning objectives?
Absolutely. Thank you, David. So by the end of this training, we hope that you'll be better able to understand Title VI obligations of recipients of federal-funded victim assistance programs and agencies, identify the critical elements of a language access plan, and be prepared to develop one within your own program. Utilize U.S. Census and local demographic data to assess the number or proportion of limited English proficiency persons by language in your service area, and plan effective advocacy with other agencies to ensure language access.
Great, thank you. And just to let people know that right now, Rocio, who's also with the National Immigrant Women's Advocacy Project, has just put the link where you can be able to get the materials for today's web conference. And Canon, you were going to talk a little. Going to talk about asking people about where they are in their organizations.
So what we wanted to do is get a sense of where you as an organization are around language access planning. And so the first question we had for you here is, how many of you have language access plans for your organization?
So go raise your hand if you have a language access plan. So we want to see how many of you, of the 219 of you joining us, have a language access plan. And just raise your hand by clicking right above Cannon's head on the left-hand side of your screen. It says My Status. And it appears, Cannon, that we have about 85, 86, 90. It's a little less than half of our audience does.
So that's actually great to see such a high level of language access plans, relatively speaking. And we just want to highlight that if you don't have a language access plan, there are a lot of your partner organizations that do have plans, and so definitely look to them as resources, and because we don't have to recreate the wheel. And the second question we wanted to ask is if regarding Title VI. And so if you get federal funding, you, A, are mandated to have an interpreter for all clients that access your services. B, should take reasonable steps to provide LEP individuals with meaningful access to programs and activities. C, must have all available materials translated for all clients. Or D, none of the above. And so if you could respond to this question in the bottom left hand.
Right, so in the left-hand corner, please go ahead and do that. And we're still waiting for people to answer. We still have a lot of you have not answered yet. So if you receive federal funding, are you mandated to have interpreter services for all clients who access your services? A. B, should take reasonable steps to provide LEP individuals with meaningful access. C, have all available materials for all clients. Or D, none of the above. And let me share the results, Cannon. And what we can see is that 55% said B, should take reasonable steps to provide LEP individuals with meaningful access programs and activities, and another 35% said are mandated to have an interpreter for all clients that access your services, and a very small percentage have said C, must have all materials translated, and only very few people have said none of the above.
And so the correct answer was B, should take reasonable steps to provide LEP individuals with meaningful access to programs and activities. And as we go through the webinar, we'll go into detail explaining why the answer is B.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much, Cannon. And so, Bibi.
Great. Thank you, David. So let me just move this over to the next slide. There we go. Thank you. So what is the importance of language access? Services and legal protections that are critical to survivors' healing process are effectively closed to survivors and victims without language access. These are really critical to their healing process, and without language access, they would have no access to these very necessary services and legal protections. It can also block access to critical documents, and not only block access, but also create issues with those documents, such as medical records, counseling records, police reports, if they are incorrectly interpreted. So it's not just a matter of language access, but a matter of adequate, qualified language access that provides correctly interpreted information. If that's not available, it can lead to conflicts, especially critical in court cases where the testimony and the written records don't match. This may be used to undermine witness credibility, and incorrect information can impact the safety and well-being of the survivor. No access violates federal law. So what is LEP? LEP stands for Limited English Proficiency, where English is not the primary language that is spoken. It includes a limited ability to read, write, and as I said, speak or understand English. So where a limited English proficiency exists, that creates barriers to access to benefits or services, as I mentioned earlier, understanding and exercising legal rights, complying with legal responsibilities, and understanding information provided by federally funded programs and activities. So whether there is a need for assistance for a limited English proficient person is determined by the person themselves and not the agency where they are seeking services. So that's a really important point to keep in mind as you provide services to clients who may be LEP. Leslie?
So the next thing we want to ask you, and this one we would like you to answer in the chat box. What do you think, if you were to put down what you think are the top 10 languages spoken in the United States, go ahead and type in some of the languages that you think would fall on that list.
Okay, so please go ahead and type in what are the top 10. And Spanish is coming in loud and clear.
Mandarin, Hmong, I can't read that fast.
Russian. I see Mandarin. I see Arabic. I see French. I see Tagalog. I saw German, French, Bosnian.
Tagalog.
Yes, we saw Somali. We saw Vietnamese. I've seen Nepali, Urdu.
Somebody just
Creole,
won my prize. They got the hard one. And that's
Creole,
German, actually.
Russian, Polish, Laotian, Portuguese, Hindi,
David?
English. Some people have included English in the top 10 languages spoken. And I see, Leslie, you have posted what they are.
Yes. So that's great. Actually, this is the first time I've asked this in a long time where people got one of the ones that's on this list. It's quite surprising, actually, is if you look at the top 10 languages spoken at home, many of them you got: Spanish, Chinese, Mandarin, Vietnamese, French, Korean, Russian, Arabic, Italian. The one people don't usually get is German. There are actually a lot of people who speak German at home, more than you would expect. And there's some significant numbers of speakers of each of these languages in countries across, in communities across the U.S. And Bibi will be talking later about how you figure out what languages are spoken in your community.
And Leslie, this is Bibi. I'm just going to jump in real quick because I need to give a shout out to Anne-Marie Hunter, who said she answered German because she went to one of your workshops.
Great, thank you. Wonderful. So it's important to understand that it's important to understand that we're dealing with a country where there are people from a broad range of countries and speak a wide range of languages. And so when we talk about limited English proficient today, we're not only talking about Spanish. We're really going to be pushing the envelope to make sure that we're providing access to everyone without regard to what language they speak. And this also includes people who are deaf or hard of hearing and use ASL. Cannon?
So another thing that we wanted to take a look at and remind people of is to also be aware of the emerging languages that you're seeing in refugee populations that could be arriving in your community. And so the top 6 are Somali, Arabic, Pashto, Urdu, Farsi, and Dari. And it was really interesting to see, Leslie, when you asked the question about what the top languages were, I was seeing Arabic, Urdu, Farsi, and a lot of the emerging languages coming up. And so obviously one of the challenges that we have with refugee populations is they may not they are either English language learners or they are limited English proficient. So that raises new challenges because they're not established within the community. So it's much harder to find interpreters and language resources to help you help them. So we're going to move on to the next part, and this is always the exciting part. We're going to talk about Title VI and the law. And so Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is the basis for a lot of the work that we do around language access advocacy. And under Title VI, it says, no person in the United States shall on the ground of race, color, or national origin be excluded from participation and denied the benefits or are subjected to discrimination under any program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. And so obviously if you look at that, it doesn't say language access, but based on regulations and some court decisions, it was determined that language access falls under national origin. And so what does that mean? What Title VI means is that any government or government-funded program must provide meaningful access to programs and benefits to persons with limited English proficiency.
Great. So Ken, let's ask a little bit about who is covered. And so I'm going to put in the lower left-hand corner an ABC. Who's covered by Title VI and federal language access laws? A, federal conducted programs, B, state, local government grantees, C, non-governmental organizations grantees, or D, all of the above. And indeed, I'm doing this live, so our answer, Kenan, as you can see, is overwhelmingly D from our audience.
That's correct. And so really what it comes down to is if you're receiving any federal money, whether it's directly through a grant or it's passed along through the state, if it originates as federal money, you are subject to Title VI and federal language access laws. And so what we're doing is we'd like to just provide some general background to all of you on what the language access laws are and the related regulations. And this is to not only in terms of looking at your own organizations, but also looking at how Title VI applies to other organizations you and your clients are interacting with. So courts, law enforcement, public benefits, they're all, if they're receiving federal funding, and in most instances they are also subject to Title VI. And so we look at it this way. There's advocating within your own organization to provide language access, but also advocating with systems to provide language access, because in many instances what we find is that you as service providers end up being the language access plan for the courts or for public benefits. And so just to remember, the information that you receive on Title VI also applies to those systems. So Executive Order 13166, it was written, and it was to provide meaningful access to people with limited English proficiency. And what it did was it required that federal grant providers, so the Department of Justice, Department of Health and Human Services, all federal agencies that provide grants, issue guidances for federal grantees on how to provide language access. And so with language access, there's a four-factor analysis on whether or not you should be providing or you have to provide language services. And so what the federal government looks at is the number or proportion of LEP individuals served or encountered in the eligible service population, the frequency of contacts, the nature and importance of the program, activity, or services, and the resources available. And so this is what's used to look at whether or not meaningful access has to be provided. So the first question is, what is the number or proportion of LEP individuals in your service area? So when you're looking at that, you want to include the language minority populations that are eligible for your programs or activities. But it's really taking a look at whether or not because of the barriers, because of language barriers, they actually become underserved. So there are certain agencies that aren't able to provide or currently not providing interpretation or language services for Spanish speakers. And so even though they're a large proportion of the population, in turn, because they're not receiving interpretation services, they then become underserved. And also, vice versa, if you have a small population of a recent refugee population coming in that speaks Urdu, you may not have the resources available to provide language accessible services, but because they're part of your service population, that becomes part of the analysis in terms of determining, well, what level of services should we be providing them in terms of language access. Okay, Bibi.
Great, thanks, Kenan. So how do you determine the number of LEP individuals in your service area to meet the requirements that Kenan just talked about? You'll want to look at data from the Census, from your local school systems, community organizations, and state and local governments to gather the most comprehensive data profile that you can for the languages spoken in your area. Another resource that you can look at is community agencies, other school systems that are maybe operating statewide, religious organizations, legal aid entities, and others. These are particularly useful in identifying populations for whom outreach is needed because they are also working within the community and might have more up-to-date information based on who they are seeing come through their doors as well. So using the census can get a little bit tricky. Their website is not exactly the most user-friendly. So we've put together a step-by-step guide on how to use the U.S. Census and use their website to really drill down and find out which languages are present in your service area. This slide and the next slide are just excerpts and screenshots from our step-by-step guide, which will be available at the materials link. And we use both visual and written instructions to walk you through step-by-step on the U.S. Census website to figure out how to find the relevant data that you need on the LEP population in your local service area. So let's show you one more piece from our guide. So as you see here, we'll have both written and visual guides. If you need help, if you don't understand one of the instructions or you get lost on the website, which is perfectly understandable, please contact us, let us know, and we'll be happy to walk you through that. Our guide also includes a section on state-by-state demographics on languages that are spoken by more than the 1,000 person threshold in each state, which I will discuss that threshold requirement a little later in the webinar, but we also have done that state-by-state breakdown, which would also help you in determining the languages in your area. And just other resources that we encourage you to explore in addition to the U.S. Census are linked here. And you can use these to also supplement your search on the census to determine the language demographics of your service area.
So next prong that we look at is, let's see, let me actually go back one, is what is the frequency of contact with LEP persons within your agency? And so in that prong, they're looking at how often you're encountering the LEP language. And so obviously the first thing that you look at is, or the Department of Justice would look at is how you're tracking that information. One of the things that you also want to take into consideration is that even if you have a majority, obviously Spanish is going to be the biggest language, you may encounter other languages less frequently, and we encourage all of you to have some kind of plan in place so that you can address or assist clients who are coming in speaking languages that you may not readily have available on staff. And so, for instance, a lot of agencies rely on telephonic interpreters to assist LEP individuals, particularly in languages other than Spanish. One thing to consider is you may not be seeing a lot of LEP individuals coming into your seeking services because you actually don't have the capacity to provide that services. And people are aware and they talk to each other and they know when they'll be able to get help. And an example that was related to me recently was in the deaf community. If somebody is trying to seek services at social services and they go there with an advocate or by themselves and they get turned away because they don't have an interpreter, that information gets out really quickly that, you know, we're not welcome here, services aren't provided, they don't have interpreters. And because of that, word gets around, and so they actually will say, well, they're not going to help me because they're turning away people that need interpreters. So what we encourage programs to do is to take a look at your numbers, to take a look at that census information. If you have significant populations that you're not seeing, you need to take a look at and try to figure out why they're not coming in to receive services. Another component is the nature and importance of the program, activity, or services that you're providing. And in general, if you are receiving money from the federal government, a lot of your services are going to be considered important. So obviously examples would be safety. So if you run a shelter, obviously safety is associated with that. Law enforcement services, services that have impacts, public benefits, courts. versus recreational or less urgent services. So if you have a tour that's conducted for one of your programs, that's obviously less important than legal services or shelter or restraining orders, right? So that's going to be a balancing test. And so, focusing on what affects victim safety, and those are going to be considered highly important. The other thing that I want to highlight is if you are receiving federal money, let's say you have multiple programs, you have 10 or 15 different programs, and only one of your programs is receiving federal money, because that one program is receiving federal money, all of your programs are now subject to Title VI.
Cannon, this is Leslie. One of the other things that I think is important to understand is for those of us that are working with crime victims generally, it's victim safety, health, well-being, those kinds of things are going to fall into the category that's the top category as opposed to the more recreational type of things.
Great. Thanks, Leslie.
So let's go ask a true-false question. So go in the left-hand corner and vote. Cost is a defense to not providing language access. True or false? Cost is a defense to not providing language access.
David,
go
can
ahead
you show us live?
I can show. I'm going to give people a chance to get some voting. Let's share it now. And overwhelmingly, Leslie and Cannon, I'm seeing that 82% say it's false. 84% say it's false. So, Cannon, what do you think of as you see how our audience is responding?
Well, and cost is not an absolute defense. It is a component that they look at in terms of when you're providing whether or not to provide language access. But going back to what Leslie said, in terms of when you are providing victim services, it is viewed as highly important. So in general, what we're seeing, at least in terms of the Department of Justice, when they're looking at law enforcement and courts, they're finding that cost is not a defense for those agencies because it's directly related to victim safety. And so some of the things in terms of strategies on addressing the cost, because interpretation, language access, it's expensive. It costs money. But what we encourage programs to do is to share resources with other community groups. An example is the city of Philadelphia has a contract with Language Line, and what they've allowed nonprofits to do within the city is to sign on to that contract because the city of Philadelphia has negotiated a lower rate. So looking at those types of things, strategies that you can employ and alliances you can form to adjust the cost. Training bilingual staff to act as interpreters and translators. That's we're seeing more frequently, and we've worked in conjunction with some of our interpreter consultants on developing and providing interpretation skills building training for agencies so that they can build the pool of interpreters. Use of telephonic and video conferencing interpretation services.
Excuse me, Cannon, for 1 second. I'm getting some background noise. I'm going to mute the phone line and then have you unmute your phone so we don't have that background.
Sure.
All guests have been muted. You can unmute your line by pressing *6.
Okay, Cannon, press *6 to unmute your line. Just didn't want to have the disruption.
Sure, thank you.
Thank you.
Other things that we've seen organizations do is pull resources, standardized documents, and sharing translated documents, using qualified translators and interpreters. So we encourage the use of qualified translators and interpreters. An example is we know a lot of organizations and agencies have said, well, Google Translate is awesome. It works so great. And an example of why you don't want to use Google Translate is recently there was a festival, I believe, I think it was in Italy, and it was called, it's annual festival called the Rapini Festival, and it's like celebrating a vegetable. And so they wanted to get people to come to this festival. So they translated their flyers into multiple languages. And then after they distributed all those flyers, somebody took a look at one of the translated flyers, and instead of saying, come to the Rapini Festival, it said, come to the Clitoris Festival. And this was all done Google Translate. So we highly caution you when you're looking at, interpreters and translators, find qualified interpreters and translators. And I know that cost is such a huge issue, but we highly discourage the use of Google Translate when you're trying to translate documents. And then also, develop use of qualified community volunteers. So tapping into your community, thinking about ways that you can provide accessibility that won't cost as much. And once again, don't recreate the wheel. If you need strategies, you need resources, get in touch with us, and we can connect you with different partners in your community, or think of ways that we can work together to assist you with that.
Yes. There is a question that I've seen come up in the chat about when staff are trained as interpreters and translators about the compensation for their services. And I know that's a complicated question, but I know that's a question that many organizations have to deal with if that becomes an additional responsibility that staff are taking on.
Definitely, and one of the things that we caution when you're relying on staff to serve as interpreters and translators is you don't want to burn them out. A lot of times what we see is the person that speaks another language becomes the default person for all languages. Also, you're taking on in addition to your caseload, you're taking on all the LEP clients. So we really caution organizations to develop a plan that provides meaningful access that doesn't burn out your staff. And we also encourage programs to include in their budgets and their grant proposals a pay differential for staff that are bilingual who are serving as interpreters and translators, that it becomes part of your job description and that you're compensated for that. And I can say as a grant reviewer, I give points to programs, and most of the people I've worked with on grant review give points to programs who recognize and budget for pay differentials for staff that are serving as interpreters and translators.
Cannon, this is Leslie. One of the other things that came up in the chat box that I think is important to note is that there's a difference between bilingual, let's say, court staff and qualified interpreters, because they play different roles and different functions. Can you explain a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. And one of the things, first of all, in terms of interpretation, native life fluency in English and the target language is really the baseline for whether or not you can interpret. The California courts did a study on what it took to interpret in the court, and they identified 26 knowledge, skills, and abilities needed to interpret, and the first one being language fluency. And so really my point in that is that just because you're fluent doesn't mean you can do it. The pass rate for the court interpreter certification exams in California was anywhere from 0 to about 45%. So you can't walk off the street and say, hey, I speak this language, I can interpret. And also in terms of when we're looking at a bilingual staff is providing services at the same level in the same way as if they were speaking to somebody that was English speaking. When you're using an interpreter, that individual serves as a conduit. They aren't providing legal advice, and what they're doing is they're conveying the communication between an English speaker and a non-English speaker. So the roles are completely different. And in terms of when we're looking at that, it takes more time when you're working with somebody that needs interpretation. And there are additional issues and challenges, particularly because when you're working with somebody that's LEP, they're going to naturally rely on the person that speaks their language to assist them. So part of the problem also with that is that as an advocate, if you're wearing the two hats of interpreter and advocate, how do you draw that line for the client? So it comes down to roles, and so ideally you have bilingual staff that can provide the service in the target language as if the person was English speaking, and really interpretation comes into play when you don't have that capacity. And in terms of certification, we generally encourage certification because there's been an assessment for the person's ability to interpret or translate. So we know that they actually have the skills needed to be able to do that. Because one of the concerns is if you use unqualified people to interpret or translate, you could be losing information, and then you as an advocate could lose something pertinent or important that to the case or to your client's case, and you would never know. So that's why we encourage looking at certification. Obviously, we know that most of us aren't going to be able to or will be able to contract with certified court interpreters, and that's where the training piece comes in for people that are interpreting. So if you have staff or volunteers interpreting, having them trained, and we at the Institute provide trainings on interpretation ethics and the basic skills for interpretation. And so one of the other things that I'm just looking at the notes, the comments, to make a distinction between interpretation and translation. Interpretation is spoken, so when somebody speaks, and it's a spoken conversation, whereas translation is taking a document in one language and then translating it into another language. We've designed the interpreter training. It's about a 3-day training. We have compressed it into a 1-day, but we generally prefer to have more time to work with them. Obviously, it's difficult to bring people together to give up 3 days out of their work schedules and their lives. But if you are interested, please feel free to follow up with us. And this is focused mostly on the skills building training. It's general, but we lean towards legal because most of the programs that we work with are providing services for victims in the legal context.
Okay, Phoebe, I'm going to...
Great, thanks, David. So language access services can be provided through 2 different avenues. You have oral interpretation or through translated written materials. Cannon mentioned that oral interpretation can take place either in person or via a telephone interpretation service, and written translation likewise can range from the translation of an entire document to a translation of a short description of the document so that the person reading it understands, okay, this is not what I'm looking for, this is what I'm looking for. But there is a need to translate vital documents. So I will review what vital documents are a little later in the webinar, but just keep in mind that with written translations, you can either have, of a non-vital document, you can either have the entire document or a short description. So let's talk about an example. An apartment in a largely Hispanic neighborhood may need immediate oral interpreters available and should give serious consideration to hiring some bilingual staff, as the conversation in the chat box and what Cannon just went over really illustrated the need for.
Great. So let's move to, Cannon, back to you.
And so really quickly, we just wanted to also highlight the Americans with Disabilities Act. Under the ADA, public accommodations and state entities are required to provide ASL interpreters and other auxiliary aids to ensure effective communication with deaf and hard of hearing individuals. And so although American Sign Language does not fall under Title VI, it actually falls under the Americans with Disabilities Act. When you're thinking about language access, we want you to also include American Sign Language, because ASL is a language. It's and that also to include the deaf community in your as you plan to develop your language access plan. So we really encourage programs to include accessibility for deaf individuals and providing ASL interpretation and all forms of interpretation. So in terms of, because it's not just American Sign Language, there's Mexican Sign Language, there's Japanese Sign Language, there's French Sign Language. So there are a lot of different sign languages out there. And so to take that into consideration as you're developing your language access plan, pretty much to take into consideration sign language as you're developing your language access plan. Thanks.
Great. So now, Leslie, let's ask the audience a question. True-false question.
So using a friend or accompanying family member to interpret is a safe practice. Please answer true or false, and David will show the results.
And I'm going to share the result. People are starting to vote. I'll share the results live. We've got 100% false right now, Leslie.
That works for me. Okay, so the next question is, if you could type into the chat, what are the dangers of using an accompanied family member or a friend to interpret? What have you seen in your practice?
And I saw one person write no with long things: bias, safety, confidentiality, age of interpreter, protection of the abuser, not qualified, emotions, bias, safety. The interpreter might be the abuser, the domestic violence. They might share information with the conflicts, the confidentiality issue.
Exactly, and we're seeing that, David. I mean, what happens with law enforcement when we're doing training for them, one of the things we warn them is you're right, the person you pick as the interpreter could actually be the perpetrator. And there are all kinds of safety issues. There are all kinds of issues relating to, going back to what I think it was Bibi early on said, if you think about a court record and cross-examination, or a medical treatment person and the kind of detail they need to get the treatment right, you can see what the dangers of having a not qualified interpreter will be. Okay.
Great. So, we want to summarize this?
Right, and so that basically a qualified interpreter is not a friend, a child, a family member of the immigrant survivor, and is not somebody who's only bilingual or bicultural or bicultural, but doesn't have actual training in interpretation. Cannon?
Yeah, and I also want to throw in bystanders. We don't like the use of bystanders to interpret, and we know that frequently that happens with law enforcement and in the court setting. So signs that you need a language access plan. So if you don't have a language access plan, taking a look at what you're currently doing, obviously, and it's also taking you can apply these kinds of these pointers to other systems that you're working with. So relying on relatives or friends to interpret, turning away LEP individuals because they don't have an interpreter. If you have no formal arrangements to hire professional interpreters. Also, staff don't understand the basics of interpretation, how to work with interpreters, if you don't have any translated materials, or you're frequently relying on non-professional interpreters. And what I mean by non-professional interpreters is I mean non-qualified interpreters, people that don't understand what the ethics are of interpretation or actually how to interpret. So most frequently it's people that are summarizing. So people that are volunteering and they don't necessarily mean to do it incorrectly. They just don't understand what their role is and how they're supposed to do it. So creating language accessibility, the first thing you want to do is establish a policy that sets standards and provides guidance to your staff on how to provide that access. And so included in that are definitions, authorities cited, so you'll also cite to Title VI, and the relation to the organizational work. Why is it important to provide language access through your organization? And the reason why we encourage including this is so that the document will continue to have meaning even as you leave the organization. So people that may be coming in may not understand language access, and they can take a look at the document and understand why language access is so important. And so if you're thinking about developing a language access plan, obviously the most important thing is to identify who's going to be implementing. So identifying a person or a team of people within your organization to implement is very important. Developing staff training and procedures, identifying your LEP deaf and hard of hearing communities, monitoring the effectiveness and updating policies. The reason why, one example is there was a complaint against the Department of Health and Human Services in a state. So we were working with some of the advocates in that state, and what we found out was that the agency actually had a great language access plan, but nobody had actually looked at it in about 10 years. So people weren't actually even aware that they had a contract with Language Line to provide telephonic interpretation, so they had repeatedly been turning away people even though they had a plan and resources in place. So once again, who will implement is important because you identify who's going to be responsible, and that becomes part of their written job duties. Outreach and notice to LEP communities, setting timeframes and benchmarks that helps keep people accountable, and then how you're going to provide that access. And once again, highlighting staff roles, interpreter contacts. So when you're creating language access and you're creating a language access plan, anybody should be able to pick up that plan and know how to get to access those resources. Training staff is also very important. Once again, going back to that story, if you're not training staff on how to work with interpreters or how to actually access those services, they're more likely not going to. They're going to be turning away LEP clients. Ensure that staff member is interacting with clients to ascertain LEP individual needs. So allowing the LEP individual to identify his or her preferred language, be able to communicate to the LEP individual that an interpreter is available, and making sure that they understand the problems that happen when you use family or friends to interpret. And so it's important that you as an organization, when you have LEP clients coming in, that it isn't the client having to request, but your staff asking them what their language needs are. What we encourage you to do as a program is to create a position of a language access coordinator, somebody that's part of their responsibilities of coordinating, implementing, and monitoring the plan. Another big thing that we encourage programs to do when in your language access plan is to develop a complaint or grievance process, not just for the LEP individuals coming in, but also for your staff that are using the language access resources.
So, Canon, this is Leslie. So one of the questions there is, so if there's a problem with a resource, it's a way of making your organization aware of that, correct?
That's correct. Another recommendation we make is to assess your LEP community. The international language programs, interpreter programs, and ASL programs within your area. These are a great resource for you in terms of both identifying languages that are out there, but there are resources for you that you can build into your language language access plan. So there are several direct service providers that are currently looking at partnering with their local university to train up their volunteers on interpretation skills building. Another component that was raised in the comments is making sure that your staff is culturally competent. So obviously we're focusing on language, but you also want to make sure that your staff is culturally competent when they're working with these populations that are coming in for services. And then also budgeting for language access. So if you currently aren't including a line item for language access for interpreters and translation, or differentials for bilingual, multilingual staff, you should start including that in your budgets. Okay, let's see. Leslie, do you mind forwarding up the slide?
Oh, yes, not a problem. Oops. Got it. Canon?
So one of the resources that's been developed is the Interagency Language Roundtable. And what we encourage people to do is to really look at and developing a mechanism to assess your staff. So when I first started doing legal services, my director came into my office and said, "You speak Korean, right? We're going to put Korean as a language that we serve." And I kept telling her, "You can't put me down because I'm not fluent. I can't provide legal representation in Korean." And she kept saying no. And for about 3 weeks, every day she would come into my office and say, "You speak Korean, right?" And I told her, "Listen, I can ask where the bathroom is. I can order it off a menu, but there's no way I'm going to represent a client in Korean." So a lot of times people think, "Oh yeah, I'm fluent because you grew up speaking the language," right? But a lot of times you grow up speaking, street Spanish. You don't speak the formal legal Spanish. So developing a mechanism so that people can actually take a look at and think about, well, can I do this in the language that you're talking about? And so the Interagency Language Roundtable is a great tool that you can use, and it's in English, and it's a scale from 1 to 5. And what it asks you is questions about what you can do in the language. So it says, I can order off a menu, and then it goes all the way to level 5, where it's like I can do a presentation on recombinant DNA and the effects of uranium exposure to the United Nations, right? So it's a scale of 1 to 5, and it really makes people think about their language skill above and beyond just saying I'm fluent or I'm bilingual. Another thing you can do is if you have bilingual staff or volunteers, conducting part of an interview in the target language, using glossaries and dictionaries. So if you are working with, whether it's even interpreters you can do this with, because a lot of interpreters haven't done a lot of work with victims of domestic violence and sexual assault, so having glossaries and dictionaries, pulling out terms related to the content of what you expect them to be working in, and seeing if they can come up with the definitions in English and in the target language. Using articles and text in the target language. BBC is a great website because they have articles written in English and different multiple languages, so you can back translate and see if people are can accurately interpret and translate those languages. Sorry, not interpret, but can accurately translate those languages back, so you get a sense of their level of language fluency. And obviously the last one is to pay for professional assessments. There are multiple agencies that do telephonic assessments on language fluency, so if that's in your budget, that's another thing we encourage you to do.
There was a question, sorry, Cannon, there was a question about the interagency roundtable assessment. Is there a website for that?
Yes, it's iilr.org.
Okay.
Sorry, hold on. Let me look it up.
Thank you. Rocio put it in.
Quickly.
Rocio already did it. Don't worry. She's always on top.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
No, I'm sorry. It's ialr.org, interagencylanguageroundtable.org.
Okay, and I'm sure Rocio will get the correct one in there.
Great. Thank you. So also, when you've got a plan, we want to make sure that you're establishing benchmarks to evaluate the effectiveness of it, to assess both the quality, really to assess the quality of your interpretation, translation services, and also in terms of if you're providing services through bilingual staff, making sure that it's meeting the needs of the staff. And going back to the census information we were going over, it's languages and language need can be very fluid. We have refugee communities coming in. And so what your service population need may be could be changing in 5 to 10 years. So you really want to make sure that your language access plan is consistent with what the service population language need is. And also you want to make sure that your staff are following the policies that are in place.
Okay,
so as I mentioned before, language services can also be provided through the availability of translated materials. Within that, programs should be providing translations of vital written materials into the language of each frequently encountered LEP group, which you will determine based on the number of LEP persons in your local service area and the languages that are spoken in your local service area. So David, let's ask a question of the group.
Let's go to the next question. So what materials are considered vital when you're looking at this issue of translation? What materials are considered vital? Go ahead and write that into the text chat. So birth certificates, retainers, intake, applications, consent forms, agency brochures, retainer agreement, again, intake, court documents.
Police reports.
Yes.
Materials, consent forms.
Great. Safety plan.
Restraining orders. Lethality assessment. Great, great. So in that same vein, let's ask another question, David.
Okay. So what documents might be considered vital for the police? So let's talk about the police, and go ahead and write in the text chat, and I will put this here. So what documents might be considered vital for police?
Witness statements, Miranda rights.
Right, victim statement, victim cards.
medical records.
Okay.
Police reports. Restraining orders. Great. And what about courts?
For the courts, many of them are similar, of restraining orders, search warrants.
Scheduling orders. Protective orders. Custody and child support agreements. Okay, and what about for victim services programs?
Okay, so for victim service programs, we see victim restitution and impacts, medical records, intake forms,
safety planning guides, consent forms. Great. It's state victims' rights. Great. So you see there's a lot of, we're seeing a lot of crossover between the three categories that we discussed here. So what are vital documents to translate? Here's an example of the most common list. Notice of free language services, legal rights and outreach information. I think I saw a couple of those in the chat. How to call 911. Notice of rights and eligibility for agency services, law enforcement and justice system materials. I think I saw someone who, quite a few of you had posted Miranda rights. That's great. Intake forms definitely are a vital document. Examples of vital documents for the courts. Notices that interpreters are available at no cost to the client, pro se forms, court order forms, and public information on legal rights. So what are the factors in identifying what vital documents are necessary to be translated? The importance of the program information encountered, services involved, and consequence to LEP individuals if the information is not provided in a timely manner. The vital documents guide that I was talking about earlier also outlines and really goes into detail on the 4 chief factors that Cannon had mentioned before for grantees that receive partial or full federal funding on how to really identify which documents are considered vital for translation under the DOJ LEP recipient guidance. That's, again, as I mentioned, Cannon had talked about that earlier, those 4 chief factors. And one of the other ways to determine, once you figure out which of the documents that you need to translate because they are vital to either services or information that is necessary to give out to a LEP client, how do you know what languages you need to translate them into? Here's where your safe harbor provisions come into play. So under the DOJ guidance we were discussing earlier, safe harbor provisions help grantees determine the languages into which vital documents can be translated. So you can use the state-by-state demographics chart that I had mentioned earlier where we break this down, and they are broken down by the languages that are spoken by the lesser of 1,000 or 5% of the population. So 1,000 people or 5%, the lesser of either, those people will be eligible to be served or likely to be encountered or affected. So if you have 1,000 people who speak German, that will become one of the languages that you will need to translate vital documents. Or if 5% of your population speaks Tagalog, that will be another language. So that's how you will determine the first group. And then if in your data research, once you use the census to find the languages in your area, if you encounter a group that is 5% of your population, but that group only has less than 50 people in it, you don't necessarily need to provide the translated documents. You can satisfy your requirements under federal law by providing a notice of the right to receive oral interpretation of these documents free of charge. And so, this is important when you think about accessibility to written translation for the languages. So it's a step-by-step process. And you'll find the languages that you need using our step-by-step guide. And again, as I mentioned before, please call us if you have questions on how to do the math, figure out what your 5% of your population needs to be. And then once you have those numbers, you will come up as part of your language access plan to determine which languages fall into this safe harbor provision to make sure that you are in compliance with the federal law. Leslie?
Yes. So to make this easier for some of you, we have been working for a number of years to develop a series of brochures, but let me start with something that can be very useful and that we encourage you in your advocacy to share with particularly local law enforcement and courts. This is a picture of a brochure that was developed by the Department of Homeland Security that provides it's two-sided. It provides an overview of the VAWA self-petitioning process, U visas, T visas, and then we have added to it some information on DACA and Special Immigrant Juvenile Status. And so they're available in Mandarin, English, Korean, and Russian. I'm going to post right now the location where you can get these. We also have 3 different variations of legal rights brochures. And they're written at 3 different, how would I put this, not all immigrants who come to this country and not all foreign-born people who are in this country, they are the same educational background and level. So we have 3 different kinds of brochures. This first one is written at around a 3rd grade level, and we have it in a variety of languages. The next one is a bit broader. All of them cover immigration, family law, public benefits, general issues about domestic violence and legal rights in the U.S. And then the 3rd one is like 40 pages long. It's written for people who might be college educated in their own countries, but want access to this information in greater detail. So those are available on our website, and more are coming within the next 6 months.
So just some really quick best practices when we're looking at language access planning. Hiring bilingual, bicultural staff who have received interpretation training if the expectation is that they're going to be interpreting. Developing qualified interpretation resources, and training that pool of interpreters on domestic violence and sexual assault, both contractors and volunteers. When we're talking about domestic violence and sexual assault, it really can be uncomfortable information, and some people that are interpreting may not be able to interpret accurately. One of our consultants who's an interpreter was talking about how she has a colleague who, when she interprets, is not comfortable talking about male or female genitalia. So when she interprets, rather than saying penis or vagina, the interpreter says downstairs area. And this is a certified court interpreter. So if you're aware that they're not comfortable with the language, they're more likely going to be summarizing and taking out things that are relevant to your client's case. And so it's important to make sure that the interpreters and translators that you're working with, whether they're contracted or volunteers, that they have some training on domestic violence and sexual assault. Arranging for contracts with a telephonic interpretation company to provide intake or services for languages that you don't have the internal capacity to address is important. And then to translate the written materials that are regularly provided to your English-speaking clients.
Okay. I can do that. Okay, so before we move into the systems advocacy piece, a couple of things. Cannon, can you repost the roundtable in the chat, the email, the website for the roundtable? And Rocio, can you repost in the chat the link to where the materials, the Go link to where the materials are going to be for the webinar? So now we're going to move into kind of the last section of this. We've been talking a lot about what you can do in your own agencies for a plan and what the expectations of the federal government are in terms of both what's required of courts and what are required of various programs and law enforcement. We're going to now talk about the fact that there's a role that all of us that are advocates and attorneys can play in advocating. Part of our work is advocating for language access with other systems providers. So what are some of the let's start off by saying, what are some of the problems that you encounter in advocating for language access for LEP survivors? Where are you seeing challenges in the justice system or in the community when you're working with survivors? Cost is one, lack of funding. Deportation, which is one of the things that permeates all of this when we're working with immigrant survivors. Getting public benefits, so there's some people having trouble getting benefits. Cost, availability. What are some of the agencies where you're having, so we saw public benefits. What other agencies are there problems? So, David, can you help me with this? I can't read this.
I see family court, housing, law enforcement, TANF,
court record,
public housing, law enforcement, housing, school, legal aid, courts,
child welfare,
hospitals, child welfare.
So this actually gives you a good picture of the various different, I would say, advocacy possibilities that are available. So the same legal framework that Cannon was describing earlier today apply not only to us as service providers, as advocates and attorneys, but the various kinds of, to give you, this slide provides you an idea about where other systems players get federal funding that triggers the same language access requirements that we've been discussing today. So from education, shelters, transitional housing programs, legal services, the courts, law enforcement, all have the same kind of obligations that we've been talking about. Raise your hand. So now we're going to go back to the raising the hand above my head on the right, I think it is. So we're going to do these separately. How many of you have worked with victims who've encountered problems with language access with police, law enforcement?
So raise your hand, and Leslie, the numbers are going quickly. So we're almost at a third of our audience has said that they've had worked with immigrant victims who've encountered language problems access with law enforcement, more than a third.
Yep,
okay, let's
absolutely.
move to the next one, Leslie. I'm going to lower the hands.
Okay.
And let's ask people if they've worked with immigrant victims who've encountered language access problems with the courts. So go ahead and raise your hand if you have had problems with the courts. And so this one, Leslie, also is a very high one that we've got over a third of our audience has experienced. In fact, this might be even a little bit higher than it was with the other one. So I'm going to lower everyone's hands, Leslie, again. And let's ask about health care. Raise your hand if they've had problems with health care. And Leslie, I'm seeing the names go up, and it's not quite as high, but still about a third, a little bit less than a third of our audience. And then I'll go lower the hands one last time. Let's talk about public benefits. Have you worked with immigrant victims who encountered language access problems with public benefits? And this number is a little bit lower than the others, but that might be because not as many people are accessing the public benefits. So we've seen, indeed, a lot of people in this audience have experienced that, Leslie.
Now what's interesting about this is that the healthcare system has been, and we see this in the numbers that we just did, the healthcare system has been working on language access for longer than the justice system and is a little bit better at it, particularly when you're talking about public health clinics and things like that. And that I think you're right, with public benefits, there's still significant problems, but less people may be accessing it. So that's an opportunity for us to talk about how important it is for us to advocate with these various systems. So what we're going to do now is going to talk a little bit about what DOJ, in the next section we're going to talk about what Department of Justice tells its law enforcement grantees what it expects of them. Because I think it's a little different than what some of us might traditionally think. But it's important to know in terms of advocacy. So police are supposed to be providing free language access to LEP persons who request it, but also in the training we do with officers, and Cannon and myself, Rocio, have been involved in, and a number of police officers around the country have been involved in doing some of the first language access training in the country for first responding law enforcement officers with funding from OVW. It's one of the grants that's supporting this webinar as well. So it's also important to note that when the officer decides it's important to get language access, that's a valid reason too. So if they're interviewing somebody who's speaking English, but they have doubts about how much the person is understanding because they're speaking broken English, they're asking questions and it may not be understood, or they want to be sure that the police report is absolutely correct, then the officer can actually seek the language access for that case. Police are supposed to inform members of the public that language assistance is available free of charge, and that the language access, there was a question in the chat, in what language? It should be the person's primary language. So if somebody speaks Quiche and can speak broken English to order in a restaurant or broken Spanish to order in a restaurant, the interpretation should be in Quiche, not in Spanish. Now, when we train police, though, there's an exception, or there's the model guidance from DOJ recognizes that when police come to the scene of a crime, they're going to need to secure that scene first, often before they get a qualified interpreter. So what will happen is securing the scene means, and they can use, the Department of Justice authorizes them to use the most reliable temporary interpreter available in exigent circumstances. So that's the subject's fleeing, weapons, somebody's bleeding, they need to figure out if something's broken, somebody needs emergency hospitalization or something like that. Once the parties are separated and everything's quiet and the police have control of the scene, the ability to use a temporary interpreter switches to requiring a qualified interpreter. And so what happens is when we train officers, we tell them that one of the dangers is when they're on the scene of the crime, they're going to pick somebody who speaks English, and they need to know that they may be in exigent circumstances for these factors picking the perpetrator. And some of them will use potentially a child to find out where the weapon might be, what happened to whom, enough to be able to secure the scene, but not get into the details of what somebody witnessed or something that they might need on a police report. And so we train officers about, in deciding exigent circumstances, you want to think about what they do now mattering later. So the pros to these temporary interpreters are safety, trying to identify offenders, etc. But you need interpreters in order to get admissible statements and to identify correctly the offender. If you don't use a qualified interpreter, you could misidentify the offender, arrest the victim, and in fact, national research that NUAP has done has found that when there's no language access qualified interpreters at crime scenes, police are more likely to arrest victims than in other circumstances. So you want to avoid trauma to the children, misinterpretation that can result. And these are some of the things that we're training law enforcement on. And so it's important, if you're thinking about it as an advocacy strategy, it's important to know that to work with your local law enforcement to get them to understand that once the exigency is passed, they should be calling on qualified interpreters. And you can advocate. Sometimes when I was, back in the day before there were a lot of interpreters around, when I was working at IUTA, what I would do is sometimes we'd go and actually make sure there was a qualified interpreter, doing less of the interview at the crime scene and more in a subsequent follow-up with a detective when you could get a qualified interpreter, so that the records were more correct. And some victims end up with no police reports because language access isn't provided on the scene. And as advocates, we can then work with victims to get reports taken later if a report wasn't taken at the crime scene. Talk about turning to courts. Courts also have requirements for language access. And in 2010, there was a letter sent to the court that said if they're to dispense justice fairly and efficiently and accurately, they need to have policies and practices that provide meaningful language access. And that when the courts, many courts receive, almost all courts receive some federal financial assistance either directly or indirectly and have obligations for meaningful language access. Now, I'm going to go for a second and talk about, let's ask the questions we asked before, how many people were having problems with various systems. I think it's also important, I know that many of you are doing this kind of advocacy in your communities right now. So David, let's ask, from a positive note, how many of you have been successful with doing language access advocacy with police? Raise your hand.
So let's see how many have been successful. And while the numbers are lower than those who had barriers, we've got about over 30 people who have said that they have been successful in working with police. Okay, let's lower those hands and let's now get a little bit of a sense of courts. How many of you have been successful in advocating for immigrant survivors with courts? And that number went higher, Leslie. And so much higher.
Right, so people are more, you have more time with courts than law enforcement, so it makes sense, but there's good advocacy, so you can see that a quarter of the people, or 1/6 of the people, have been successful in doing language advocacy with courts. Let's go to
health care. Have you been successful in advocacy with health care? And so what we'll see is the numbers seem to be a little bit slower in health care, though we've got some. So
have to do with the fact that there's less language access problems people are encountering. Okay, and lastly, public benefits. David?
Public benefits. So let's see, have been successful in advocating with public advocates. And we actually are getting we are capping at 29. So it seems to be getting a similar number of people that have been successful with, except courts was the one that was higher.
Yes. So this is a good illustration that it can be done. And so it's the way we kind of like to think about it is if you're working on a case involving a limited English proficient survivor, part of your case planning and your safety planning will be language access planning, not only with your own agency, but with the other agencies around. And that what we found is when we looked at national research, which I think will be available at the court link, at the materials link that we're going to be providing at the end. What we found is where advocates and legal services agencies have ongoing working relationship with police, courts, and healthcare providers, where those relationships exist, language access improves. There's a dramatic difference between, and in fact, when we interviewed people nationally, law enforcement officials talked about the fact that their relationships with victim advocacy programs were an integral part to building good language access plans and processes for their agencies. And so what you want to do, where you can plan in advance. So anytime you have a court hearing, you usually know with some advance notice when you're going to court. And then so that part of your case planning can actually be planning to make sure that the interpreter in the language you need is going to be there on the day that you need it. Whether it's you're going to file papers and you need some help in the clerk's office, or whether it's an emergency protection order that you're planning as opposed to an emergency order to do it, so you're going down to file the papers, also for the court hearing. And the same thing with benefits granting agencies. You can give them a heads up so that they can provide interpreters. So it's a combination of figuring out whether you're going to give them a heads up so they'll provide the interpreters, or whether you're going to have to do more of that groundwork yourself.
Okay, so Cannon, I just have to let you know that we're running tight on time and we only have 5 minutes left. And I know you've still got another 5 slides that you're going to go through.
No problem. I'll talk really fast. And so for systems advocacy, and once again, we're here. This is the start of our conversation with all of you, so we're here to support you. So if you have any questions or you have any follow-up, please feel free to contact any one of us, and we're here to help you on addressing these issues. So in terms of system advocacy, we've seen, in terms of the most successful programs, it's when a program has identified somebody that's devoted to working on language access, and that person coordinates the language access efforts along with other agencies in that area. And so in Massachusetts, what they actually did is they actually applied for a private grant and they funded a language access advocate position. And so that person was facilitating a lot of their efforts around language access. So we definitely encourage somebody that's focused as part of their job on language access, because you all have full-time jobs, and advocating for language access is a full-time job in and of itself. There are different models for system advocacy that people have done throughout the country. So don't recreate the wheel. If you're interested in systems advocacy, get in touch with us. Los Angeles and Washington State, different legal services agencies filed Title VI complaints successfully against their courts there. Obviously, the consequence of noncompliance is the withdrawal of federal funds, and so that really is the hammer. So if you're dealing with instances where programs or service providers aren't very amenable to providing language access, possibly looking at a Title VI complaint. That being said, the process for getting a Title VI complaint investigated, it's about 2 years before the DOJ would come out. So the DOJ encourages programs to engage in systems advocacy before they file the complaint. The complaint process is filed through the Office of Civil Rights Compliance and Review. There's a form online that you can fill out. If you're interested in that piece around filing a Title VI complaint, you can get in touch with me and we can talk a little bit more about the process.
Well, great. So we only have a few minutes left, but we do want to hear from the rest of you about from what you've learned today. And I know there's a lot of information. What do you plan to take back to your agency? We'd love to just get a sense from you about what you're looking to take back to your agency. We will be having all the records available. I know many people are asking for a compilation of the links, and I think we'll be able to provide that.
In fact, David, what we can do while people are typing about what they're taking back, and also share the chat with people, what we can do maybe is show them some of the technical assistance resources. Can you flash our website and then APIs, and we'll show them what it looks like?
Okay, great. It's wonderful to see people being more intentional and thinking about reviewing their plans. And what I'm going to do, it's going to take me just a moment to get to that so I can
If there are things people are typing you want to highlight while he's looking, that would be.
Okay, great. Well, we are, I'm going to first go to which one, API or yours?
API first.
API first. Okay, great. So what I'm going to do is share on my screen, and this should work for most of you, an opportunity to see, and I'm just trying to, here I am now starting to share. You will see the API,
Want to talk about what you have here?
So on our website, we have resources around interpretation and language access planning. So once again, you don't really have to recreate the wheel. A lot of the information and resources is already out there. So if it's not on our website, please feel free to get in touch with me, and I will connect you to a lot of the work that's being done around Title VI compliance, language access planning, and working with interpreters.
Can you show ours, David? While David's pulling up ours, can you go down a little bit? We've collected, this is an area of the law, as Cannon mentioned earlier, where there's a lot of different federal policies and questions. Don't go down so far, David. Can you go up a little bit? Up, David? Yeah, just to the link. There. Perfect. Stop. So in the first one, we have all the federal policies and the questions and answers and information from the federal government. We have tools for language identification. We have some examples of state plans. We have a lot of training materials and tools and demographics materials based on the 2010 census, materials for courts, materials for police, and then some tip sheets on interpretation. We also have a chapter in our sexual assault manual that is available. So for many of you, we just opened this new website. If you are looking for materials that you may have from us, and if you are having trouble, if you hit a broken link, we're trying to avoid as many of those as possible, but please don't hesitate to contact us. Our lead person on language access, technical assistance here is Bibi, who is presenting today, and we welcome your thoughts and comments. We do technical assistance and training, and we have the web resources available to you. David, can you show? There we go.
Great. So I just want to make sure that people get to have the information so they can be able to where to contact both Canon at API Institute Technical Assistance and also NewApp Technical Assistance. It is appearing on your screen here, and that you also have the web libraries that are available. And I do want to encourage all of you to do this. You can also get a copy of all of the slides with all of the links that we will be having and sharing that. And I believe that we'll probably see BB just posted where that's going to be, newapp.org/go/LEP. So it is now 12:30. Conclude. I want to thank our speakers today.
Can we put up the last slide? Next one. Next one.
Ah, right. Thank you. So we do want to thank all of you in multiple languages and be able to do this. And I want to thank our speakers. Thanks to Canon, thanks to Bibi, and thanks to Leslie. And most of all, thanks to all of you in our audience for asking great questions and sharing your expertise and knowledge. And we look forward to seeing you at a future NewApp Web Conference. There will be a evaluation that will be sent to you in the next half hour. Please fill that out. And if you have any other questions, feel free to contact. So thank you all very much. Any last words, Leslie, Bibi, or Canon?
Thank you very much for joining us, everyone.
Thank you very much. And please don't hesitate to contact either API Institute on Gender-Based Violence or NewApp for further questions on language access. We look forward to working with you on these and other issues going forward. And thank you to David and Calcasa for hosting this webinar.
Okay, this concludes today's webinar from NewApp. See you in the future web conference.